parts of the country. Assyria now is threatening Israel. We know all that, and it's been so good that the church is going over the same kind of information because now it's all kind of making sense, kind of coming together, hopefully for most of you. And we talked about the fact that there's some key points of any nation that is a large, influential nation that we can see and we can learn from in the breakdown before that society ends. And last week, I said that the average life of a powerful nation is 200 years. And that the Roman Empire, being one of the most powerful, went 300 years. And here we are, the United States of America, just over 200 years already. But Israel, of course, is unique in that she is a nation that is set apart by God for a particular purpose. And that is to deliver a message to the rest of the nations about who he is. So she has a particular call. So her breakdown is most tragic because of the fact that she is the light of the world, as Jesus put it. Oh, thank you, honey. Isn't she wonderful? I clear my throat right now. Long needs something. So Israel is intended to be, as a whole, the light of the world to all the other nations. And this is what I want you to really get from this today. What is that light? The light that Israel is supposed to give to the rest of the world is what we're going to talk about today, which is what the prophets identify as their downfall. And again, the review is on your notes. The steps for the declining nation is the breakdown of the family unit, the breakdown in education of character, morality, truth, and social values, breakdown in religion, breakdown in morality reflected in pleasure-seeking, breakdown in economics motivated by greed and power instead of personal productivity and benefit to society, breakdown of government that it no longer serves the people, and breakdown in the purpose for a military unit to protect the societal needs. All of those areas break down within a nation. And we've seen it in every nation that's been come to power and then lost its power. We see these somewhere within that deterioration process. That's what we talked about last week. Well, today I want to talk about Israel's downfall and the internal things that were going on with her that led to that. We know that there was a breakdown of all those things within the nation of Israel. But why? Why was there a breakdown? I'm going to regret doing this, but we have to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Please go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 5th book of the Pentateuch. And this is a restatement of what you would see in a lot of Exodus when God gave the law to Moses. And then Moses is coming toward the end of his life, and he's reiterating many of the things that happened during that journey out of Egypt, and how God met with them and what he told them, and the covenant that he made with Abraham and then passed on to Moses, that I will bless you as a nation, and you will be a blessing to all the nations. So he's reiterating that in chapter 4. So I wish I could, this is one of those where I wanted to read the whole chapter, and I know we don't have time. But we need to go back and be reminded of what was Israel's call. What had God done with this nation, and what was he going to do with this nation? What was his plan for the nation? And then when we look at it now in Amos's time, we can kind of see what's happened a little bit. So starting in chapter 4 of Deuteronomy, verse 1. And now, O Israel, I'm reading out of the New American Standard, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform, in order that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. Now those statutes and judgments, that's the law that he gave them to live by. You shall not add to the word which I am commanding you not to take, nor to take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I commanded you. Your eyes have seen what the Lord has done in the case of Baal Peor. For all the men who followed Baal Peor, the Lord your God has destroyed them from among you. But you who held fast to the Lord your God are alive today, every one of you. See, I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess it. Verse 6, here comes the warning. So keep and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say. So this is what he's saying. This is where Israel was to be the light of the world. The people, you're going to go in there and you're going to start living according to these statutes and judgments, the law. You're going to start living this out in front of these people. And this is the response of what the people is going to be when they see it. Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what nation is there that has a God so near to it as it is the Lord your God whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you today? Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. But make them known to your sons and your grandsons. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so they may learn to fear me all the days of their life that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. So what we have here is that Moses is saying, if you take the laws and the judgments and the statutes that the Lord your God gives you, and if you live by them, if you go into the land and actually put them into practice, the people around you are going to go, wow, these people are amazing. Their God is amazing, because look at the way they live and what it does to them when they live this way. They're going to say, these people have it so together. They just have a nation that everybody would want to be a part of. They're so wise. They're so loving. They're so together. They're so unified. They've got this down as what it means to be a nation. And the nations around us, they are going to be in awe if they practice the law. Now, we think many times that the law is something negative. The law was a burden on their back. It was something that they had to try to bear that they could not bear. And that was true because they were sinful people. But the purpose of the law, which I don't want us to miss from this passage, was to make them a nation that all the nations around them would go, wow, we want to live like these people. We want what these people have. So the purpose of the law was to bring a standard of justice, which I want you to pay attention to that word that we're going to talk about. It brings a standard of justice where everybody in the land lives well, because they follow God's laws, which is what the judgments are. They're justice. Administering justice is what it means to follow judgments, and righteousness means to administer justice in the land. And they're going to see this and go, no other nation has ever been able to do this. No other nation has been able to live like this, with a God like this, and we want a piece of that. That's what Israel was supposed to be. Now, obviously, there's a correlation to the church, right? And that's why I say this is the same exact thing that we saw in Paul's letters. That's what the church is supposed to be. The church now are the people of God. And people should look at the church and go, wow, their God must be something, because these people, despite all of the things that go on in life, can love each other and support each other and do truth and righteousness, and justice rules over them. That's what we're supposed to be. Bummer, huh? Don't think that's happening real well. Any better than it did with Israel. So this is the law would build a structure in society that would cause the people to be in awe. To be in awe that people can actually live this way. And the word to define it is that justice would reign. Now we're going to go into that word justice. We have to, because we have a distorted mentality of what justice is as human beings, we want to look at what does God say justice is? What is justice? Because you know what? These are the foundational things regarding what the prophets are saying. Justice, that term, and righteousness, that term, are really the two underlying things that caused Israel to fall. It was no justice, no righteousness, and the prophets say it over and over again. And I don't want us to miss that, because I do think it's a major theme. And I do think it tells us something about God's intention for people as a whole. And I think it also shows that we as nations try to mimic that. We try to bring that about, but there's obviously a distortion, and that's what we want to look at today. So, two questions. One was one of the questions I asked last week at the end of the lecture, which we'll do second. But the first question is, what was Israel's internal downfall then? What happened to her? And as it says there, it was a failure to administer justice according to God's righteous standard. That was the cause of her internal downfall. The breakdown of the family, the breakdown of education, the breakdown of religion, the breakdown of morality, the breakdown of economics, the breakdown of government, the great breakdown of the military, all happened because of this failure to administer justice. And we will look at what this word justice means. So, the definition of judgment, and I want us to, first before we get to that, I want you to jump down below where the first verse underneath there says Amos 6:12. Does everybody see that? And that's part of what we're studying in Amos. Amos is speaking to them and he says, shall horses run upon the rock? Is it wise to run a horse on a rocky ground? No, you don't do that because they're not made to do that, right? So he's asking a rhetorical question. Duh, no, you don't run a horse on a rock. Will one plow, it's supposed to be one, where they're with oxen? No, if you've got big boulders, you're not going to plow with oxen there because it's going to hurt the oxen. They're not going to get very far. That's, again, a rhetorical question. Duh, anybody who plants a field or runs a horse knows that. You don't do that. For ye, and he's making a comparison then to the ridiculousness of that to where Israel is right now. For ye have turned judgment, there's that word, into gall, and the fruit of righteousness, there's the second word, into hemlock. So here we have the prophet Amos is telling them, these are the two foundational things that should be no-brainers. Just like it's no-brainer that you don't run a horse on rock and you don't plow with oxen and boulders. This should be a no-brainer. This should be common sense. You do not distort judgment and justice without them being poisoned. That's really what he's saying. And their lack of justice and their lack of judgment has poisoned their nation. And I dare say it's been poisoning humanity the whole time, our inability to do this. Okay, so Amos makes that. I want you to notice those two words, the word judgment and righteousness. And then the other verses that I have there before we go back up to the notes. You'll see the other prophets, and I couldn't put them all in here. I mean, there's like 50 of them, because the prophets use this phrase over and over and over again, and that's why I think it's key here. But we have a tendency to just read it and not notice it. So Isaiah 59:14, and judgment is turned away backward, and justice standeth far off. He's saying the same thing. You've distorted judgment and righteousness on those two, and he calls it judgment and justice. It's still the same words, justice and righteousness. Both those words mean those things, and no matter how he restates it, if you look it up in the Hebrew, it's going to be the same words, justice and righteousness. Psalm 82:2, how long will you judge unjustly and accept the persons of the wicked? Ezekiel 45:9, thus saith the Lord God, let it suffice you, O Prince of Israel, remove violence and spoil, and execute judgment and justice. Take away your exactions from my people, saith the Lord God. So get rid of all these other things and do these two things. Justice and judgment. Those are the two things that you need to do, or justice and righteousness, because that word justice actually means righteousness. Justice and righteousness, in other words, adhering to laws and then doing right by those laws, seeing the laws and doing right by those laws. That is the foundation of your system. If you do not do those things, your system will fall. And that's what's happening. That's what the prophets are telling them. You have done away with judgment or justice and righteousness, and therefore now your nation is falling, because that is the foundation of what God gives us to live by. And we'll get back to that. So then in Jeremiah, he says it again, shalt thou reign because thou closest thyself in cedar? In other words, build a nice pretty house. Did not thy father eat and drink and do judgment and justice, and then it was well with him? So again, we have those two terms, very significant to the life of Israel right now. Okay, so back up then, let's define judgment, which is, and I put parentheses there, sometimes it uses the word justice. So definition of judgment is a verdict of divine law or a legal decision. So when he uses that word judgment, it means a verdict of divine law, meaning the law was given, and a verdict means you choose, right? You find out what's right, and you go according to the verdict of what's right. So a judgment is a verdict of divine law, a legal decision, deciding between two things. Which, as I was talking with my sister, just to add this in as a thought I had, what this means to me is that then if we were not fallen people, wouldn't need justice. Do you see what I'm saying? Justice is a decision to do the right thing, and if you haven't fallen, you're just doing the right thing, right? You don't need the judgment then as to whether or not someone did right or wrong, because without the fallenness, we just need, justice was purposeful for a fallen people, is what I'm trying to say. So the law was given for a fallen people so that justice could be re-administered to their way of life. That's what it was for. So then the second word, which is the definition of justice, actually means righteousness. It means a right relation to an ethical or legal standard, which would be then the judgment. So justice is being in right relationship to that standard that was given, to that law that was given. It means righteousness, as it states there, blameless conduct and integrity. That's what the righteousness part of it, and sometimes it's said as justice, sometimes it's used as righteousness, it depends on verse, but they are the same two terms. Anything I've got bold printed down there in the bottom, judgment and justice are those two terms. And sometimes it's righteousness, and sometimes it's said as judgment or justice. Okay, so then we've defined that. So then down below, what this is saying is that God's people had ceased to make determinations of right based on relationship to God's standard. That's what these two terms are saying. That's what the prophets are saying by these two terms. Israel, you have ceased to make determinations of right or correct judgments, administering justice and righteousness, based on relationships to God's standard. So in other words, you are now failing to make your decisions based on the standard that God gave you, because God's standard is where justice is defined, and it's only by following His standard that actual justice will take place. If we move away from His standard, there is no longer justice, but injustice. Now, I could go on to that for like 4 hours in order to really get the drift of what's being said here, but I can't, clearly. And this is what's frustrating to me. But I want us to get that. That's what he's saying. There was a righteous standard, and that standard was the law. We are fallen people, so therefore God brought in a standard and said, in order for us to have justice, this is what you're going to have to live by in order for there to be justice. Now, I want you to understand that that kind of justice meant that all people are on a common ground. We're all in the same playing field. Nobody's different than anybody. It doesn't matter if you're a priest, if you're a poor person, if you're a farmer, if you're the king, if you're a prophet. It doesn't matter who you are. For God, all people are on the same, because we're all made in the image of God. So justice, that's why we see, have you ever seen in the United States, the woman who is justice with her scales? Have you ever noticed that she's blind? She has a blindfold on? That's what that means. It means that justice it has nothing to do with what looks like on the exterior or the position you're in or the circumstances you're in. It has to do with the fact that you are a human being made in the image of God. Everybody then is on the same playing field, and justice has to be given to all. Now, our country is trying to do that. We're trying to give rights, right, and human rights to all people. There's a difference between justice and human rights. They're contrary to each other. But we've taken now, because we've taken God out of the picture, there is no longer the standard of justice that God gives. There is now man's definition of human rights that now relegates how we do things and how we make decisions about people. You cannot take human concepts and actually bring biblical justice or any kind of justice, because God is the establisher of justice. There is no such thing outside of God. There is no concept, there is no definition of what true justice is outside of God. Because justice for God is, I created these people for a reason. I will treat them all different. I will love them fully, and they will love each other. That's justice. Do you see that human rights are human rights based on what's good for the whole? No. That's right. Justice is based on the whole of God's people. That's the way God sees it. He doesn't see one person is different than the other. He sees all people are the same, and when we learn to treat each other with that blindfold on, administering His law, His standard, justice will take place. And the nations will be in awe when this happens. I think we're missing something, don't you? That's why, I mean, we could talk about this term justice for a long, long time. Because this is the key to God's heart. This is what God wants for his people. And I am so far off. I can't do it.
These are the words that you were looking
Yes,
for.
yeah. So God's people have ceased to make their determinations of right. They've ceased to make determinations of right or pursue justice and righteousness based on relationship to God's standard. We're no longer determining what is justice and what is righteousness according to God's standard. But now we're trying to determine righteousness and justice and remove the standard. In America, isn't that what we're trying to do? We're trying to get rid of the standard and still have justice and righteousness. It can't happen. It cannot happen. And that's what these countries, these nations are trying to do as well. Israel was slowly deteriorating the standard and yet trying to administer what God said was justice and righteousness, and it couldn't happen. It can't happen. Human beings that are fallen cannot do it. We can't do it. It's not in us to do it. That's part of being fallen. We've lost that concept. Okay, so over on the next page. The purpose of biblical law, and I don't want us to miss this, the purpose of God writing the law, which are the judgments that we talked about, those adhering to a righteous standard, is to enable us to love God and love our neighbor, which is what justice is. Okay, we can stop right there. This is what I want us to see. I'm going to say it again. The purpose of biblical law, the purpose of God giving the law to the people, was that, first of all, there was no other way for them to administer justice to each other or find any kind of righteousness outside of his law, is to enable us, this is his purpose. The law was given so that we could love him, love God, and love our neighbor. Now, isn't that exactly what Jesus said in the New Testament? What is the greatest of the commandments? The whole point of all that the law was given was for those two reasons. If you don't get anything else from this, remember those two things. The purpose of the law, the purpose of whenever God gives us directives, it's always to teach us to love him better and to teach us to love each other better. That's always going to be what God's trying to do. And that is justice. When we love each other the way we're supposed to, as human beings that respect and honor and consider each other valuable because we're made in the image of God, not for any other reason, then you have justice that takes place. But if that's not going to happen, if we're going to change the standard to being something about how much money you have, how much political power you have, how beautiful you are, where you live, who you're related to, if now that becomes the standard, it's all going to crumble. It can't function because there's no justice. There is no righteousness in that. And that's what Israel was doing. And we don't want to forget that. So, this is justice and righteousness. To enable us to love God and love our neighbor is justice and righteousness. So, Israel's goal in moving into the land with God's law was to show the other nations by them loving God and loving each other how awesome God's law was for human beings. That's what real justice is. That was their goal. This was also what guides, and this is where we can come down to what we talked about last week, and you can see I put all 7 of those in. This is what guides our design, this idea of loving God and loving our neighbor, for family, education, religion, morality, economics, government, military, which is the downfall that I talked about last week. So loving God and loving our neighbor has to be what motivates us in every aspect of those parts of society. So when we're in a family and we're interacting with one another as a family, we want justice in the family even. But justice is that together we figure out how do we love God and love each other to the best of our ability so that we show the world what justice really is. It plays its part in the family. What's the breakdown of the family? Selfishness. That's exactly what God's trying to. That's why in the New Testament Jesus says you got to die to self, because you can't have this. You cannot experience what God wants for us as long as we are selfish. We can't. There is no justice in selfishness. It's only when we have that idealism of loving God. How do I best love God I best love my neighbor or my husband or my uncle or whoever it happens to be, how do I best love them has got to be how we make our decisions. That's our design. How do we do that? And this is where it comes in with the church. So when it comes into education, it's the same thing. When we educate, how do we educate in a way that teaches our next generation how to love God and love people? Love each other. It's the same thing for government. Government's role and the king's role in Israel was to make sure that those things, through his prophets and priests, that the people were being taught through the law how to love God and love each other. And that's exactly what God is saying through the prophets. That is the total breakdown of Israel right here. This is it. This is the breakdown of every human structure. Is it because these things are not there? So failure to do this often it leads to injustice, right? And unrighteousness. So without those, we cannot live that way. And we can see it happening in Israel's life. Question number 2, and this is what I asked at the end of the lecture last week. Where are we as a nation in that process of the breakdown of the family, education, religion, morality, economics, government, and military? Where is the United States of America in that process of breakdown? And what part does the church play in it? Well, I don't think I needed to answer the part of where our nation is in this process. I can just tell you to go and watch the news or read the newspaper or just experience life. Where we are as a nation in this process, what are we as a nation in this process? So down below this, our nation, like Israel, fails to administer justice according to God's righteous standard. The laws and the idea of human rights is not based in the biblical foundation of loving God and loving people. It's not based in that. It's based in how do I give a person the right to do what they want. And you know what? My only right as a human being, my greatest right and my greatest privilege is to love God and love other people. To love each other. To build a nation that reflects that kind of unity and that kind of righteous judgment, justice. That's the only right I have. I don't have a right to anything else, but you know what? I don't need anything else. Because once you have those two things, you have freedom. That's where freedom really is. We are blinding, we are just beyond stupid if we think that human rights, following that standard of human rights, will give us human freedom. It will not. It cannot. There is no such thing in our definition of it. God's definition says that if you love me with all your heart, and that prompts you to care about other people and the unity of the human state as a whole, you will be free. That's freedom. That's really what it is. Now, like I said, that could go on for we could talk for, and hopefully we will at another time, because the prophets are going to bring this in over and over again. So, our nation, like Israel, fails to administer justice, or that idea of loving each other and loving God. That's not our standard. So we can expect our nation to disintegrate, just like every other nation has. It doesn't have this. So then the church. So what part does the church play in it? The church, like Israel, is given the responsibility and the privilege of making justice and righteousness a priority in our daily lives. Our call as a church is no different than Israel's call. The only difference is that now we do not live by law, we live by grace, because God was fully aware I can give them all the principles of how to live with justice, but because of their wickedness and their selfishness, they won't do it. So therefore, I will put it in their hearts. I will put my spirit in their hearts. I will no longer do it by laws that they have to follow. I will put it in their hearts to long for this. We as human beings long. We long for justice, for that kind of justice, for that kind of love. That's who we are. We can't function any other way. Every motivation of our heart, everything we do, and even every bad choice we make is based on the fact that we want to be loved and we want to be just like it. We want to be treated like everyone else, right? We want to be valued just for who we are. Isn't that the depth of who we are as people? That answers every problem that we have of insecurity or selfish, that's the problem right there. That is it. It defines it. So, we are doing the same thing. This means everything we do is motivated by loving God and loving others. That's where justice comes from. That's where a strong nation comes from. That's where a city on a hill with a light that puts the nations in awe comes in. When we can do that, people will want it. Because it hits at the basic root of who we are as people. Amos 5:24 says, "But let judgment run down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream." 2 Samuel, and David reigned over all Israel, and David, a man after God's own heart, this is why he was a man after God's own heart, he executed judgment and justice unto all the people. Psalm 89, "Justice and judgment are the habitation of thy throne. Mercy and truth shall go before thy face." God's throne is established in justice and judgment, and those two things. Psalm 82, "Defend the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy, deliver the poor and needy, rid them out of the hand of the wicked." Does it ever tell you to make the poor rich? No. It just says no matter who they are economically, treat them with justice. Put the blindfold on and love them because they're people. That's why you love them, for no other reason. Because God does. Psalm 56, "Thus saith the Lord, keep ye judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come and my righteousness to be revealed." Jeremiah 23:5, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, whom we know as Jesus Christ, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth." That's his goal. Ezekiel, "Thus saith the Lord God, let it suffice you, O princes of Israel. Remove violence and spoil, and execute judgment and justice. Take away your exactions from my people, saith the Lord God." And as I said, this is like an eighth of all of the verses. If you were to go through all of the prophets and see how many times they mention justice and judgment, it's unbelievable. So, my challenge to us, number one, how do we live as a body in Christ who has justice as our goal? Which means that everything we do is motivated by our love for God and our love and respect and care for people as a whole. Which means that I'm not the top priority. We are the top priority. I am not the one who needs my rights. We, as a people, need the correct portions of righteousness together. How do we encourage that with each other? And then the key thing here for many of you, how do you teach justice and righteousness to the next generation? We're teaching our kids a lot of things. Is justice and righteousness one of them? We send our kids, we want them to know the Bible, but do we know that the Bible is all about loving God and loving people? Do we train them in what that, because we don't come by it naturally. Is that the goal? Think about that. Talk about that with your kids. How can we learn to be people who love God and love each other so that the people around us are in awe at the wisdom and the wonder of God who rules us and his ways? That's our goal for the next generation. That's our goal for this one. Let's pray. Father, as fallen people, you know we don't get it. This is something that does not come naturally to us. It has to be supernatural by the power of your Holy Spirit. But your word is powerful, it is living, it is active, and now it has pierced our hearts with the truth of who you want us to be as people. But we come and say, Lord, we're not able, we're broken. We are selfish. We want our independence. We don't want to be those who look for justice for all. We want our justice. We want our righteousness. We want us to benefit from it. Lord, teach us to be people who want every aspect of our living to be affected by true justice, which is to love you and to love them, whatever the cost. Because from that, we get peace and joy. If we will walk that walk, that's what our return will be. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the power in it. Help us, God. These are difficult concepts. Help us to not walk out and leave it. Help us to remember. In Jesus' name, amen.